Hi everyone and welcome to the next part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote, "Chess is so inspiring that I do not believe a good player is capable of having an evil thought during the game." From Wilhelm Steinitz, the Austrian-American chess master from the 19th century and the first undisputed world chess champion. Now, a review of the last part where we finished the second chapter on open files after discussing an example to highlight the difference between an evolutionary and a revolutionary attack, the restricted advance in a file, and the outpost. So now, moving further into the book, we begin chapter 3, the 7th and 8th ranks, where Nimzowitsch gives an introduction to the chapter Endgame or Middle Game, the choice of an objective, and explains a commandment, "Thou shall not shilly-shally." He writes, "As we have seen in the second chapter, the entry into enemy territory, in other words into the 7th and 8th ranks, forms the logical consequence of play in a file. I have sought to illustrate this entry by some particularly marked because catastrophic examples. But I must here, to offset this, emphasize the fact that, in the normal course of events, it will only be late when we pass into the endgame stage that the 7th rank will be seized. For catastrophes of whatever nature are, after all, only the result of serious mistakes of our opponent, and consequently cannot be regarded as the normal. We are therefore disposed to regard the 7th and 8th ranks as endgame advantages, and this despite the fact that numberless games are decided by operations in these ranks in the middle game. The student should, however, try to break into the enemy's base as early as possible, and if he at first finds that the invading rook can accomplish nothing or is even lost, he must not be discouraged on that account. It is part of our system to instruct the student at the earliest possible moment in the strategical elements of the endgame. Accordingly, after treating of the 7th and 8th ranks, passed pawns, and the technique of exchange, we shall insert a chapter which, though properly coming under the heading Position Play, must for instructional purposes find a place thus early. And after assimilating this, the 7th and 8th ranks will be to the student not merely a mating instrument, but much more, a keen-edged weapon for use in the endgame. As already remarked, it is both, but its use as an endgame weapon predominates. It is of the greatest importance to accustom ourselves to carry out operations in the 7th rank in such a manner that we have from the start some settled, definite objective. It is characteristic of the less practiced player that he chooses an opposite course. In fact, he shilly-shallies. That is, he looks now to the right, now to the left, without any fixed plan. No, settle on your objective is the rule. Such an objective, as we have learnt, may be a pawn of a point, which matters nothing. But aimlessly to drift from one to another, this will expose you to a strategical disgrace. And here Nimzowitsch discusses about the convergent and the revolutionary attack in the 7th rank. The win of a point or pawn with acoustical echo that is with simultaneous check. He explains this through an illustration where we have this position on board. Nimzowitsch writes, white chooses the black c pawn as their objective. After rook c8, attack and defense balance one another, but by a procedure analogous to that used in a file, we now seek to disturb this equilibrium to our advantage. Accordingly, let us suppose white to have a bishop at e1 and black a knight at g6. We should then attain our end by bishop g3. And if our bishop had been at f1 instead of e1, by bishop a6, driving away the defending rook. Next, let us suppose the forces here increased by a white rook at d1 and a black knight at g6, and that the white h pawn is missing. The logical course would now be rook d4 to c4, or alternatively rook d8 check, rook takes on d8, rook takes on d8 check, knight f8, and white gets back into the 7th rank by rook c8, c5, rook c7, and so on. In the position on the board as it stands, it should be noted that the march of the white king to c6 would be the course to be aimed at, since the point c7 is our chosen objective. Moving further, Nimzowitsch gives another example to illustrate the same concept. He writes, the affair takes a similar course in the position here. White's objective is h7, since the win of this point would give the possibility of a deadly enveloping movement. Rook h6, knight f5, rook h5, g4, rook takes on h3 check, king g2, rook takes on b3, and with rook h7 check, white has got there. The defender, the black rook, had to flee. White wins the point h7 and gives mate. King g8, rook g7 check, king f8, and rook h8 checkmate. The nature of a convergent attack on a chosen objective would seem to have been sufficiently illustrated by this example. Before, however, passing to the revolutionary form of attack, we would underline as important the following rule. If the objective takes to flight or tries to run away, the rook must attack him from the rear. For example, a rook in the 7th rank, let's say on g7 here, holds the black pawn at b7 under attack. If now b5, then rook b7 and not a flank attack in the 5th rank. This rule finds its explanation in the following considerations. A. The 7th rank is to be held as long as possible, since it is here that new objectives may present themselves. B. The enveloping attack and rook b7 was such is the strongest form of attack ranged in ascending scale. Number 1, frontal. Number 2, flank. Number 3, enveloping. Which, point C, often forces the enemy to undertake cramping defensive measures. It should be noticed that in the case considered above, a flank attack on the black b pawn would be comfortably met by rook b8. Nimzowitsch gives another illustration with the help of a diagram where we have this position on board. He writes, let us choose g7 as the objective. The fact that this point is well protected does not frighten us. We concentrate our attack by means of knight g3, a3 by black. The passed pawns are very threatening. Knight h5, a2, queen e5, and now mate is threatened by rook takes on g7 check. However, a1 queen and the g7 pawn is now protected and white loses. So our objective g7 was ill chosen. The right one is h7 and its conquest follows from a revolutionary attack. Knight f6 check, g takes on f6, queen e6 check, king h8, queen d7. Or knight f6 check, king h8. Black is stubborn. Queen takes on h7 check, white still more so. G takes on h6, rook takes on h7, rook h7 mate, and on the chosen spot, that is h7. This example shows us the idea of a revolutionary attack applied to the 7th rank. One pawn is forcibly got out of the way in order that action in the 7th rank may be extended to that neighboring point which we had thought of as our objective. Nimzowitsch continues to give another illustration with a diagram where we have this position on board. He writes, here the point g7 would be hard to attack successfully, though if white's pawn at g4 were absent, this would be easier, for instance by queen g4, g6, queen h4, h5, queen takes on f6, and so on. With the pawn there, however, matters are not so easy, for if rook d7 threatening rook c7, then rook c8, or if rook c4 threatening queen f7 check, then rook f8. The right play therefore is rook takes on g7 check. h7 is our objective. King takes on g7, rook c7 check, king h8, and queen takes on h7 mate. The capture at g7 extended the range of action in the 7th rank to h7. If king f8 here, then queen takes on h7 would also have won, since the 7th rank could not be held by black in any manner. Still more precise, however, would be the employment of the queen with gain of tempo, thus queen h6 check here, king e8, queen e3 check, king f8, queen e7 check, enters the 7th rank with acoustical echo, that is, tempo of a check, king g8 and queen g7 mate. This last maneuver deserves comment. It is typical since by its means any approach of the enemy reserves can be prevented. Nimzowitsch then gives this position to illustrate the concept of acoustical echo or tempo of a check while gaining our objective. He writes, White wishes to take the knight with a check. This he does by queen g4 check, king h7, queen h3 check, king g7, queen g2 check, king h6, and now queen takes on h7 with check. That is to say, we drive the king to the desired side of the board without losing contact with the piece or point we wish to win. Nimzowitsch gives another illustration with a diagram to explain the same concept, where we have this position on board. He writes, the point to be won is e7. Either queen h4 or queen f2 check would fail miserably because of e3 check and rook a1 mate. For example, queen f2 check, king e8, queen takes on c5, e3 check, and so on. The right move therefore is queen f1 check, king e8, queen b5 check, king f8, queen takes on c5 check, king e8, and queen e7 mate. We could also state the problem as follows. White to take the point c5 with check. After queen f1 check, king e8, queen b5 check, white has contact with the point c5 and at the same time does not lose their driving effect on the enemy king, who is tied to his own square. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses about the 5 special cases in the 7th rank. He writes, number 1, 7th rank absolute with passed pawns. Number 2, doubled rooks give perpetual check. Number 3, the drawing apparatus rook plus knight. Number 4, the marauding raid in the 7th rank. Number 5, combined play in the 7th and 8th ranks, enveloping maneuver in the corner of the board. By 7th rank absolute, we mean that our control is such that the enemy king is shut in behind it. Nimzowitsch gives an illustration regarding this where we have this position on board. Nimzowitsch states that if the black pawn was at f7, control would not be absolute. He explains the first special case with this position on board and writes, the first special case, 7th rank absolute with well advanced pawns wins almost always. White plays b7, after which rook c7 and rook c8 cannot be prevented. If the black king had been at g6, the game would have been drawn. Nimzowitsch gives two more diagrammatic illustrations to further explain the concept of the 7th rank absolute, of which the first has this position on board. He writes, the following is decisive. Queen takes on h3 check, rook h6, queen takes on h6 check, g takes on h6 and b6. Since the 7th rank is now absolute, if it were not, if the black b pawn still stood on its original square g7, the game would be drawn. The next illustration is from a position reached in a game between Siegbert Tarrasch versus Emanuel Lasker from 1918, played in Berlin. Nimzowitsch writes, Lasker in a note points out a win by rook a2 check, king f1, a5, rook takes on g7, a4, rook g6, a3, rook takes on f6 and rook b2. The 7th rank for black is absolute and black wins. Interesting, on the other hand, would have been after rook a2 check, the attempt to neutralize the absolute 7th rank by king e1. Lasker gives the continuation a5, king d1, a4, king c1, a3 and king b1 with a draw. Moving on, Nimzowitsch discusses the second special case. Doubled rooks give perpetual check. He writes, the second special case, draw by perpetual check, which has an interest from a psychological error which is common. In the position on board, white, a player of little experience, sees the desperate position of his king and plays for a draw by rook f to e7 check. White, rightly recognizing that rook d to e7 check would lead to the black kings eventually reaching sanctuary at b8. If rook d to e7 check, king d8, rook d7 check, king c8, rook c7 check, king b8, and white has no checks left. After rook f to e7 check, king f8, rook f7 check, king g8, rook g7 check, king h8, rook h7 check. If instead rook g1, then comes rook f2 check, winning for black. So rook h7 check, king g8, rook g7 check, king h8, rook h7 check, and king g8. The white player looks their opponent in the eye. Do they really think they can escape? Repeats the checks as above a few times, and then, just for variety's sake, gives check with the other rook, rook d to g7 check, after which the game is lost, since the black king reaches sanctuary at b8. From which follows a moral that variety is not always profitable. The rook at d7 was a sturdy sentinel and as such should not have been needlessly disturbed. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here, and we shall continue onwards from the next one. Shout out to walkerboy for gifting 5 subscriptions to viewers on my Twitch stream last week. Skwerly aka Derek with 4 tier 1 gifted subscriptions and 1 tier 2 gifted subscription, which also happens to be the first tier 2 subscription on my Twitch channel. Thank you for that, Derek. RockyMtnChess with 1 gifted subscription. An anonymous user with a gifted subscription. Tangledqueen for subscribing to my Twitch channel last week. Snoemanking with a subscription. Olipals, the top chairer with 1920 Twitch bits. Jacob G99 at second with 420 bits. Tangledqueen at third with 400 bits. Faraway at fourth with 300 bits. RockyMtnChess at fifth with 200 bits. And Skwerly at sixth with 120 bits last week. And then support by an anonymous chairer or chairers with 2300 bits last week as well. Thank you for the tremendous support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.